Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Ryden. He was orphaned by the age of 3. He was fostered and reared by a man who had little to do with him as a young adult. At the age of 27, he is said to have married his cousin, who by some accounts was 13 years old at the time, maybe 15. He was widowed 11 years later, which may have led to his battle with alcohol. And despite it all, he became known as the architect of the modern short story. But his first love was poetry. And we're all very familiar with his most famous poem, The Raven. He was Edgar Allan Poe, of course. And thanks to our guest today, Dwight Thomas, there is a new biography of the troubled writer called Dr. Poe and Dr. Moran, a medical biography of Edgar Allan Poe. Welcome, Dwight. Glad to have you with us today.
Paul, thank you so much for having me. I hope I don't get too long-winded and sort of keep to the point, which is sort of difficult because it's rather an expansive book which covers a lot of subjects. The basic thing which I'm about is trying to pin down a medical biography of Poe and the medical problems he and his friends had.
Yeah, what is the difference between a medical biography and a regular biography? Because I know all his medical records were lost, right?
No.
No, that's the conventional wisdom is that all his records are gone.
No, we have enough to. I would go out on a limb and make a diagnosis, which wouldn't not necessarily satisfy everybody. The thing is, you're making diagnosis from manuscript documents, which have sort of survived in a haphazard fashion, but they have survived, and you need to know the symptoms and the limitations of physicians in the early 19th century. And you need to know, above all, the documents. And I would go out on a limb and say that my title of the book, which I show you if you
Sure.
get a picture, that Mr. Poe and Dr. Moran, the personalities named on the cover along with Poe, Dr. Moran was Dr. John J. Moran, who was a 29-year-old physician in Baltimore on October the 3rd, 1849, when Poe was delivered into his care. And he has the distinction of being simultaneously our best eyewitness and our least reliable eyewitness. What he did after Poe's death was something which was immediately hushed up and was sort of vague references to it in the newspaper, sort of evasive accounts, sort of a standard reference, which they, with you are asked to have sympathy for the maladies which affect geniuses. It was something which embarrassing. The problem which you can, if you have the documents and you study them and you look at the symptoms that you have recorded, is that he was suffering from early onset alcoholism. When you mention the word alcoholism, it's a 20th century term, which usually is a real turnoff for most people because they envision you're talking about a derelict or somebody's skid row, which
Right.
people sitting on a park bench drinking out of a brown paper bag, which we still have, and that's the visible image of alcohol consumption disorders, but that is not necessarily the case. It wasn't always interesting to us as somebody of extremely high intelligence, highly disciplined, who drifted into what you would call an alcoholic pattern of consumption. And it's difficult to explain that in words. If you go into the 19th century back, they just sort of didn't know how to do anything except, damn, with a sort of a moralistic judgment. These days we're a little bit more sophisticated to consider alcoholism as a medical problem. Of course, that's sort of our principal cause of death among young people these days is not infectious diseases. Not too many people die of tuberculosis or pneumonia anymore, but they are likely to die of drug overdoses. When we were talking about back in the early 19th century, what the drug that was of concern was alcohol. The country was sort of awash in cheap distilled high potency whiskey, which you could go to the convenience store and pick up a gallon of whiskey for a nickel. Anybody could go put down a nickel and you got a gallon of whiskey. It was not taxed. It was not regulated. And you had an extremely virulent uh, pattern of alcohol consumption, which is eventually why they went so far as to pass a constitutional amendment, the 18th Amendment, went into effect in 1920, say with no intoxicating liquors, no beer, no wine, no anything. You can't manufacture it, you can't transport it, you can't sell it. And that was such a terrific flop, because you had half the population that thought it was a good idea, and the other half of the population thought it was a ridiculous idea and wanted to do everything they could to get around it.
Well, let's get back to your book for a second, because you are pretty hard on Dr. Moran. Why has he come off as such a bad guy here? He was under Poe was under his care for only 4 days. He was there. He witnessed him, and he heard him say, "Lord, help this poor soul," and he was gone. What made him such a bad guy after that?
Well, he didn't, during his treatment of Poe, he acted responsibly. He didn't understand. He didn't have any interventions. If somebody is going into, shall we say, somebody with advanced alcoholism of the type that Poe had, which uh, sort of these are people that go into intermittent binge drinking. When they drink, they tend to drink to the point of being incapacitated, which is the worst kind and really causes problems for the people around them. He acted responsibly as as a physician. What happened back in 1875? There's a different story, which is what I'm trying to document in my book and explain. He went into a song and dance, and after Poe was sort of buried in an unmarked grave in 1849. And a quarter of a century later, 1875, they put a monument with grand fanfare over his grave in Baltimore. And then a few years later, the actors in New York were going to put up a statue of Poe in Central Park, which is sort of a turn that they were in the phase of putting up monuments to honor Poe, because it was obvious to them that Poe had done something which no other American writer really had done before that time. He was becoming a figure in world literature. And even today, if you go to China or Japan or anywhere in Europe and you ask them to name an American writer, they're going to mention Poe first of all.
Hmm.
Not that they have ever read everything Poe wrote, but they know who Poe was. But what Dr. Moran later went is to try to cook up a fabulous account of Poe's demise. You must understand, for personal reasons, Poe's first biographer was a man named Rufus W. Griswold, who got to know Poe in 1841, and Poe managed to offend him, and they were not temperamentally compatible. One of the things I do in my book, which hasn't been, I try to focus on the personalities who had dealings with Mr. Poe, including Mr. Griswold, which also, if you're interested, I'm trying to put a picture of Griswold, which maybe you can pick that up. There's what he looked like, because I'm trying to provide extreme authenticity. And I also was showing what the people looked like, went to great pains to try and get images of the people who preserve documents, because I'm all about documents. I don't function without, documents. So many biographies are just sort of put together from people that they read like novels because they're largely novels, and they a lot of authors sort of bridge things over with their own imaginations.
Right.
But Rufus W. Griswold in 1850 wrote the first biography, which was sort of a memoir of Poe, which was included and eventually got to be the first edition of Poe's works in 4 volumes. It was Griswold's memoir, who portrayed Poe as a malicious drunkard. And everything he did, this is not just somebody who had an alcohol consumption. This sort of that his friends knew that he had a problem with alcohol, and a very serious problem with alcohol. But Griswold portrayed him as a real down and out drunk and a really disreputable person that didn't pay his debts. Well, of course, he was constantly running into debts. He was not a good businessman, wasn't he? Was more interested in creative literature in his life. If you say, well, this is poverty and alcoholism, that isn't exactly the case with Mr. Poe. He was trying to be a creative writer, and this was a place where they didn't pay people to write books, and they don't pay them too much to write books these days. The more serious the book is, the less likely it is to be sold, and anything which they can sort of put it on something which can be put on department stores counters in Walmart or something. And
Well, yours is a very readable style. It's accessible for people. What do you hope readers will get out of this book?
well, they can get what they want to get out of it. But what I'm interested in is trying to do a reconstruction, which would be readable, which is 100% nonfiction, as close to being 100% nonfiction as you can get. Of course, some places I have to use speculations. When I render a speculation, I'm citing a document saying if we know what Poe was, for example, in Richmond, Virginia in 1849 by the survival of important manuscript letters, we can figure when he got to Baltimore in the following month, he was in the same boat that he could not pay for a proper hotel room. And so my suggestion, which is somewhat hypothetical, he went to Gunner's Hall, which was the name of a tavern. But of course, with that particular location, as taverns in the early 19th century, they also usually rented rooms to transients. And that is probably the reason why it was founded, that location. A great deal of speculation has been suggested that he was sort of grabbed by a political gang and taken to the polling place. But that of course, is newspaper speculation. I'm trying to, if you're interested in Poe, this isn't trying to make it as interesting as possible, but I'm trying to document and show how the principal fabrications and the thing when you're writing biography, when something gets put into print, it doesn't necessarily die. It stays in print forever. And if it's in the case of a biographical, uh, you know, apocrypha, says George Washington
Right.
chopped down the cherry tree and that sort of thing, the big apocrypha in Poe's case was that he was grabbed by a political gang and they kept him imprisoned in a cellar overnight and took him out the next day and voted him in 11 different polls. Uh, that is sort of what that is. That's newspaper apocrypha. Not
Right.
that there wasn't political fraud going on, but if you got people that you could sort of sort of the drinking man sitting around with free drinks, and we'll make a rounds of the polls. 'Cause in those days, they didn't have voter registration lists or photo IDs or any kind of governmental. You just happened to be a white man and you showed up at the polls and you were allowed to vote. So that there you have voter fraud going on. And uh, the idea that Poe was imprisoned in a cellar and taken out, that is newspaper apocrypha, which was put in circulation in 1860 by John Reuben Thompson, the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger, who suddenly subsequently went on like to give lectures about Poe, which is sort of had circulation about that. There's no basis for that. In fact, what the most likely reason for Poe being at that location probably had something to do that he needed the cheapest hotel room in town, and that they were renting out rooms to transients on the second floor right over the tavern. So that is another reason, which is an alternative explanation, which certainly should be conceived, because the idea that the cooping, which still floats around, is maybe good if you're trying to entertain people that this could have happened, but there isn't any documentary evidence that that happened.
Well,
What I'm
I say you have been interested in Poe for the last 53 years. You've been working on stuff around Edgar Allan Poe. What got you interested in him?
well, it had something to do with my receiving a doctoral fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which was where Poe spent really some very productive years between 1838 and 1844. And I was on location. If you want to do original scholarly research, you need to go where the original documents are and where there's sort of a tradition of doing scholarly research, and people will encourage you, sort of saying you're doing the right thing, but because trying to reconstruct the past from scholarly documents and, trying to piece things together and transcribe documents and locate documents and study documents, you need to be on the scene, and you need to have a sort of faculty members who will sort of give you at least a lot of encouragement. Not that you will tend to get a lot of flack. The previous biography was done by a professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, Arthur Hobson Quinn, whose 1941 book is still sort of indispensable, but of course, in many ways, it is outdated, and there are a lot of things he didn't touch upon. But he did very, very good work. Of course, he worked back in the 1930s, which is getting to be 100 years ago. He did not, a lot of things he did not work about, but he's a documentary scholar. So most of the biographies that you're likely to find on the in libraries are sort of popular biographies that people did not necessarily spend a lot of time looking at the archives, and they may have looked at other popular biographies and sort of put something together. And that is what happens if you have friends literary agencies in Manhattan. That can happen. You can knock out that, and they tend to have a very wide circulation. But you wonder how much is documentary actually founded in facts, where the author is just sort of uh, sort of bridging over. Hervey Allen back in 1826 did sort of a romance. He intended to do a historical romance about Poe. And so he wrote a big biography, which was sort of half historical romance and half documentary. He was interested in the documents, and he liked to cite the documents. But then, of course, he's always slipping off into romantic reconstructions, which I try not to do that. I was trying to do something which would read like a novel, but which would be entirely uh, based, at least on the documentary records that we have. And I think that would be, we can identify the documents, and they have been very carefully edited by particularly the University of Virginia, starting in about the 1920s. There are certain people that undertook very large scale work, years of work to try and edit Poe's letters. John Ostrom's edition of Poe's letters that originally came out in 1948, sort of 100 years after Poe's death, and John Carl Miller's um, books on the massive collection of documents that John Henry Ingram collected, who was the English biographer who corresponded with people and amassed a very large collection, which went to the University of Virginia and was very, we're talking about thousands of manuscripts and reminiscences. A lot of it is junk, but some of it is authentic and well worth being considered. Right, writing biography is always a problematical.
Well,
You're asking.
well, your book has been thoroughly researched, and one of these days somebody's going to come along and say this latest work about Poe is also indispensable. And I want to thank you, Dwight, for being with us today. Good luck on the book. And you'll notice that I went through the whole interview without once saying nevermore. That's pretty good.
Well, that's good.
The
Well,
book is Mr. Poe and Dr. Moran. It's available on Amazon. Get it if you're interested in the master of the macabre. Dwight, thanks again for joining us. And thank you, folks, for spending a few minutes with us on the Global Book Network. I'm Paul Ryden. We'll see you next time.